while I'm sort of warming up my vocal cords, I just thought I'd show you a quick animation, like a bit of an old silent movie. Story from New Order, quite a while ago, about why profitability is actually important. I'd love to have been at that party when I sold 500,000 records back in those days, but not be the accountant when they found out they're actually making a loss on every single record. So, yeah, and Blue Monday did go on to become the biggest selling 12-inch single of all time. So, just as, you know, it's a slightly silly example, but I think it's really, really important, and always has been, to actually understand where an organisation makes money, where it doesn't make money. So I'm just going to talk about profitability in the legal sector. Just a show of hands, is anybody familiar with the sort of legal sector of professional services? Yeah, got a few, okay. And for the rest of you, you know, I think the same sort of concepts will apply as well. I'm really hoping that, firstly, you get an understanding of what law firm profitability and analytics looks like and what's actually involved with it. Secondly, actually understand and know how Prevero can actually support some of those analytics choices and methods. And most importantly, I think, why you're all here, I suppose, is to actually learn from our mistakes and what can we do better next time. So, I know, top of mind, everybody's thinking, right, I've been charging an absolute fortune as a lawyer. Why do law firms need to understand profitability? You know, you look at some of the charge-out rates, you look at the offices that they have, and you might be right in thinking so. I think traditionally, they haven't really focused on the bottom line. It's always been about top-line numbers. It's becoming much more important now. There's a lot of market disruption going on. You know, the sort of top 10 law firms in the UK are actually pulling further and further away from the rest of the field. And as a result, the next 10 are actually looking at merger and acquisition activities to try and keep pace. Part of the reason, according to PwC, why that's the case is, you know, there's a lot of technology investment going on in robotics and artificial intelligence and sort of generally improving scalability. And, you know, the holy grail of delivering more for a lot cheaper is actually you know, we're starting to see some of that. And also, you know, there's always been the holy grail of kind of alternate pricing methods. Lawyers, the basic business model has always been, you work an hour, you charge for that hour. There's not been a huge amount of control around how many of those hours are. And, you know, understandably, clients don't always like that. But I think more and more, they're actually demanding, not just asking for, kind of the fixed price methods. So you really do have to know how much it costs to deliver a particular project, and understand the profitability behind that if you're going to survive in that world. So, back to where it started. I think it's about a year ago, last summer. I thought this was a good idea at the time. They asked me to come in and said, right, you know, we really need some help with our reporting solutions at the moment. What can you do? So, having a couple of months sort of poking around, looking under the bonnet, having a few conversations with various stakeholders around the company, what I found was a pretty standard list of issues. You know, the reporting that the finance team do are very limited, mainly because they were restrained by an ERP system, which is a transactional system, not a reporting tool. As a result, the reporting basically consisted of either extracting everything into SQL and reporting it, or just dumping it into spreadsheets and a whole load of pivot tables and lookups and pretty much all the other evil words around spreadsheets you can think of. And also, you know, there's far too many power charts. I had to do something about that straight away. And I think more importantly, from the stakeholders' perspective, it was very time consuming. Not only did they not get the information that they needed to make critical business decisions, it was also coming late. So, you know, we had to do a bit of breadth, you know, improve the breadth of information and also improve the velocity of how it got there. So like I said, this isn't actually an uncommon situation, and, you know, the finance team, to be fair, were really up against it with what they had and the tools that they worked with, and did a pretty good job. But this was really about taking them to the next level. So in that situation, first thing that comes to mind, and I think this is the solution that they also had in mind as well, is, well, why don't we just put in a reporting cube, and that's going to solve all our problems. You know, we can dump all our data in this cube. It'll be faster. You know, we'll get much more insights. and so on and so on. My experience, that's usually a bad idea. So quick show of hands. How many of you think that you've got thousands of reports that are just not used? There's a few of you. How many of you have got reporting systems that are just, when you try to run a report, takes about 6 weeks to sort of generate anything? Yeah? And how many of you actually got users that are actually really satisfied with the output that they get? Prevero customers excluded, obviously. Yeah, so in my experience, I mean, the minute you put in a brand new reporting technology, the first thing that happens is, I can tell you now, every time you put in a new solution, it's easier to generate a report than the last time. So what do users do? Firstly, they'll try and put as much data in there as possible, and then wonder why it doesn't support, wonder why the performance is poor. And then secondly, they'll create every single permutation of reporting possible, and suddenly you've just got this explosion volume of reporting. And again, that really frustrates the end users because, you know, these days, you know, much more information flying at them, less and less time to process it in their heads. So they really need something a bit more targeted. And I think the key thing to any reporting solution or analytics solution is actually targeting it at the audience to make sure that it's relevant to what they're trying to do, the decisions that they're making, what their day-to-day activity is. Generally, you'll find that they've got a half-an-hour window in a week, and that's when you have to get their attention. Anything outside of that window, if they don't have the information, they won't use it at all. So, back to basics then. Let's work on an information strategy. And when I'm talking about information strategy, I think we just go back to first principles. Why are we putting report systems and analytic solutions in the first place? Business leaders make decisions, and ideally, we really want them to use facts to make decisions, not intuition. Alice and I were at Gartner a few weeks ago, and I had a great quote that I just thought I'd share with you. Intuition is basically a data science algorithm that happens in one's subconscious, and I thought that pretty much sums it up. Across the business, you'll find some people just get those commercial decisions naturally. Others are not quite there yet. I think what we have to do with analytics is actually give them that level playing field so that everybody's making the same decision with the same level of consistency across the board. So, how do we do that? And what are those decisions? Well, ask them. You know, that's the first thing I did. You know, what decisions do you make on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, yearly basis, and so on? And then try and map out who makes those decisions. So we went through a fairly extensive exercise of actually understanding that. Firstly, because it helps, you know, understanding how frequent those decisions are. You know how frequently you need to publish that data. Secondly, you understand the sorts of information areas that you need to start to capture. And then drilling down to it, just give you an example. Have a look at one of those decisions and just kind of draw that thought process out into a flowchart. And in this particular example, do we need to retender for a client? And you start by looking at, well, what's the current profitability on it? And each stage of that thought process, as you go all the way to the end, actually make that decision, there's some information requirements. Coincidentally, if you've actually done this piece of work, just to sort of tee up our further discussion, this actually helps you with your kind of predictive analytics and machine learning type decision support. So keep that in mind for the moment. So now we've actually got information. We know what information we need to produce. How do you actually structure it and present it in a way that you get maximum attention from the business? But not only that, but also get them to actually do stuff with it. And that's where we came up with the concept of value leakage. What we did was actually look at the professional services business model, more specifically in the law firm. And we said, you know, the way it works is every hour that you work, you bill for it. So the first protocol is how many hours do we have available and what's the maximum rate we can charge for it? What's that number? And these are made up numbers, by the way, so I'm not giving away any commercial secrets. At that level, what's that number? Secondly, if we actually bill the hours that we have billed, and charged our maximum rate, what's that number? So the difference between the two is what we call the utilisation rate in an organisation. And the action that we want to try and, the action that's going to try and improve our utilisation rate is improving selling performance. And then the thought process then goes down, well, how do we improve sales? Well, we can either sell more to existing clients, so we're looking at KPIs such as cross-selling, but more importantly, we also want to look at what customers think of us. There's no point trying to cross-sell us if they think we're a bunch of overpaid, I won't say the next word. But also looking at how do we get new customers as well. So we're looking at cost of acquisitions, win rates, and so on. So this gives you a bit of a framework of actually how to categorise all these myriads of result indicators and metrics, so that when a partner in a law firm or a decision maker who's very time poor looks at it, they straight away know exactly what they need to do. So, I think as we go further and further down the chain, we end up looking at profitability type metrics, and ultimately we have the amount that's available for distribution. Challenge we had at Bond Dickinson specifically is actually how do we calculate profit? And that's going to be, I'm going to spend a bit of time here. And again, I'm going to leave it to you guys to sort of drive. I'm going to try and skip through it and just sort of talk about the brief concepts, but please do sort of stick your hands up and, got any questions, or even if you want to heckle for a bit, just hear somebody else's voice for a second. So, first question I actually asked was, you said you want profitability, but what is actually profit? And it's not an easy question to answer, because everybody you asked had a slightly different definition, firstly, of what they thought it was, and more importantly, what they wanted it to be. Now, this is a law firm, and lawyers, believe me, are brilliant at arguing. It's a really highly valued skill. So I made the first rookie mistake and said, right, why don't you tell me what profit is, and try to arrange workshops with the partners, creme de la creme at arguing, in a room, going through the minute detail of this. So if you've ever seen the video of herding cats, this is about 10 times worse. Just to sort of guide them through the process, what we did was looked at some design principles, which is we need it to be simple, we need it to be insightful, transparent, so you can see exactly what's going on, but more importantly, we need to drive accountability. Those decisions those actions that we saw in the value leakage chart, we needed people to own that, and without that accountability, it just wouldn't work. It reminds me of an oil and gas client I had quite a while ago. Believe me, they had the best activity-based costing allocation system I've ever seen. Every last penny was allocated to a profit centre in a way that actually made sense. The problem is when you talk to the business, the managers would get the report and said, I don't recognise any of this, and it just kind of got filed in the bin. So we wanted to move away from that. The second part of the discussion is then around the content, what's included, what's not included, and then thirdly, for the more mathematical amongst the lawyers, we did a bit of discussions around the method and how we actually allocate the costs. So, going back to that accountability, unfortunately, as a result of accountability, your role on your business will determine what costs you're in control of. So that adds a bit of a complication. So, for example, if you're in charge of client relationships, you're absolutely in charge of any client investment time, any business development activities that go on for them. But if you're in in one of the practice areas or one of the teams, that's nothing to do with you. You don't control that budget. So it was felt that it was unfair to allocate any kind of business development expenditure to those areas. So as a result of that, we had a multi-dimensional profitability step model. And again, it's nothing new, but what it does do is if we went with the original idea of a SQL Cube and Power BI on top of it, we wouldn't have got this. And I'll come on to that in a minute. And the third aspect was, well, how do we actually allocate the costs? Great thing about the legal services and professional services is it's a really simple business model. the costs are pretty fixed. It's literally your salaries, but it's just apportioning those salaries to the time that you spent delivering project work. That's the method you've got to understand. And there are three types of maths that you need, three types of mathematical methods that we looked at. Firstly is the tried and tested standard cost method, which is, you have an average cost per hour by individual and apply that to the number of hours worked on a particular client. Advantages, it's simple to understand, everybody gets it. Disadvantages, it's not the most accurate in the world. So to get that level of accuracy, we looked at, well, what have they actually spent on a client versus what their actual salaries were. And you can actually get down to the granular level. And it really does reflect reality. Disadvantages, think about the behaviours you're trying to drive. What happens in an actual hours is if you've got an individual who is very, very busy, the number of hours they actually work is high. Therefore, you're dividing the same number by a higher number, which gives you a cheaper cost per hour. So if you're in charge of a client relationship, you're going to go for the cheapest lawyers, who also happen to be the busiest. So it wasn't quite driving the behaviour, spreading the work around, and using greater use of internal teams. And then there's the third option, which is a kind of hybrid, which is kind of saying, okay, we'll just look at the percentage of time you spent on each client, and that percentage of your revenue will go there. So those are the kind of three principles that we agreed on. So does anyone want to walk through the numbers, or should we just skip ahead on how it works? Okay, very quickly then. I've got a three lawyer team. What we have to start with is the number of target hours and an imaginary salary in this case. Lawyers in reality get paid a lot more, believe me. And what you have at the beginning of the year is the cost per hour. As you go through the year, you'll do some work on clients. In your time recording systems, you'll have the number of hours you've actually worked on that client, and it's a very simple one by the other, or at least so it seems anyway. Then it's a case of understanding, what other costs you need to apply. For example, any investment time, any, one of the big ones that we have is, or any law firms will have, is free training or secondees. And it's applying that to each individual client as that first stage. My problem is I'm quite a dyed-in-the-wool accountant, and I do like things to be reconciled back to the top level. So the additional aspect of the standard cost, which is why it's not as easy as it seems, is to say, well, their target hours was, in the case of the partner, was 1150. He actually worked 1,000 hours. So the actual cost per hour isn't quite as accurate. So what we have is an under or over absorption calculation, and the recommendation is you can either ignore it, or if you want your constituent elements to add up to the total number that's being put in the GL, is to create a dummy employee and allocate it against that. So I couldn't think of a more imaginary, fun-sounding name than dummy, but okay. So that was our conceptual side of things. So how did we go about implementing it? And more importantly, Alice would like me to tell you why we went with prevero. Conceptual architecture. Again, this is nothing out of the ordinary, but this is what we felt would deliver what we needed to do. We already had a general ledger. CRM system was in process of being upgraded, as was several multiple HR systems, and a whole series of miscellaneous Excel files which captured data that just wasn't stored in a system. We already had a kind of rudimentary data warehouse, so our first step was to actually map out the data requirements, that we map out what we needed, go through the data integration layer and cleanse it. The cleansing bit actually took the longest part of the project, and stick it into that data warehouse so we have the information that we need available. That calculation for profitability, and also the method of showing it, and the fact that we've got multiple scenarios, whether we do it on a standard cost basis. Typically I'd do standard cost basis if I'm trying to go for pricing. I'd go for actual hours if I'm looking at individual performance appraisals. And thirdly, I'd look at the proportional hours if I'm looking at how a client's performed over a period of time. So different scenarios. And again, a standard spreadsheet couldn't handle that. So what we looked for was firstly a choice between, firstly we looked at standalone cost management applications, and there were a couple we looked at there. But we looked at future-proofing ourselves as well. You know, what else are we trying to do as a finance team and as an organisation? And we felt that a CPM application would be the best way forward. You know, we didn't need the likes of Protocapo because, you know, our costing application wasn't, our costing functionality wasn't massively onerous. So, you know, a CPM application was, you know, perfectly adequate, and, you know, and certainly in the case of Prevero, certainly powerful enough to do that. But also in the future, we can start to do our planning, budgeting and forecasting in there because we're already pushing our actuals through it, and it's not a huge step to go that bit further. And also for the legal law firms amongst yourselves, we looked at things like legal project management where it's in the pipeline of things to do. Prevero has that functionality to do some rudimentary project management. We're already going through the setup. So whilst we might not have a perfect application, I think it will do 90% of what we need to do in the future, but that's still to be evaluated. We did look at other CPM vendors, but I think we looked at Prevero mainly because, actually I had a slide for that as well. Firstly, it had the functionality that we needed to do. It can do all the calculations at sufficient scale. Most importantly for me, project management and implementing systems is all about change, and 2/3 of your effort is actually spent on people. With Prevero, we had quite a low change impact, mainly because, you know, the look and feel looked like a spreadsheet. Finance were already used to that. They would be the ones using it on a day in, day out basis. And they also, you know, took it and they loved it. And I think lastly, it was future-proof. You know, it could do other things. You know, the flexibility that was talked about earlier about the Prevero application. I think for me, that's what excited me to it more than anything else. Is, you know, how much more we could do it. I'm very, very, very agnostic about. I'm very, very against implementing new technology for the sake of new technology. My philosophy has always been be very clear on the problem you're trying to solve. But secondly, the chances are you've already got something you can reuse to at least get you halfway there. Just want to mention one more thing about Prevero as well, the reason we went for it. You know, we've kind of got a multi-vendor landscape as a result of this. And with Prevero, because it works with SQL quite well, the integration of it was actually a lot easier than some of the other products would have been. So again, that was another big win for Prevero. How did we go about implementing it? Well, again, I think the philosophy was, well, how do we do it with the people that we got with the lowest change effort to try and get that buy-in? And, you know, it was really the finance team driving it. They already had some rudimentary spreadsheet models. It was really about expanding that out as a first step. And we created those examples. Once we had those examples, you know, we handed it over to Alice's team and me here as well, to start to build that small-scale prototype with a limited data set. Mainly because, you know, if you throw in 12 months worth of data, if it's wrong, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. So, you know, do it in small bite-sized chunks to sort of get it right bit by bit. But I'm also a big believer in agile methodologies. Like, you do a bit, you show a bit, you get that feedback, you do a bit more. And again, I'm going to have to show of hands here again. When those of you who do projects, how many of you know exactly what you want to deliver right at the beginning? None of you. How many of your users know what they want right at the beginning? Very few. So, you know, the thing about Agile is, you know, you start by, just on that smaller scale, people see a bit, they get inspired by what else you could do, it triggers more ideas. So it means that you don't actually have a firm Gantt chart. So, you know, it's a PMO's nightmare. But I think what you get at the end of it is actually much more relevant to what firstly the users want, and secondly to how you deliver it. And lastly, just finish off in terms of lessons learned. I mentioned that you know, managing people is actually the most important part of a project. If you want a solution to be sustainable, you need the buy-in from everybody concerned. And I think initially with it being a law firm and being a lot of partners there, I think most of my focus was actually on the lawyers, the people actually making the decisions. And some of them had to teach them how to use a mouse to actually get to use the information for starters. And that was a lot of the effort. But I think you can easily underestimate the amount of effort it takes to actually get finance on board. If you think about it from a rational perspective, it's an absolute no-brainer. You can do more for less, your life's going to be a lot easier, all these things in the pipeline that you wanted to do. But the problem with that is that, by implementing Prevero or any other BI solution and a calculation model, is, they're letting go of fundamental beliefs that they've been doing, for a very long time. Last time I tried this, I didn't get many laughs either, so I suspect I'll bin this one. And one of those beliefs, again, I think everybody's in the same boat. Finance teams tend to be very wedded to spreadsheets for a whole multitude of reasons, and some of them are perfectly valid. The problem is that, we started to do a spreadsheet mock-ups and then build a cube around that. It's not, if I'm being honest, it's not the best way of doing it, because what you can do with a data cube is, far, far greater, and you kind of miss out a lot of the possibilities. And it does take slightly longer, even though you got that buy-in process. So, had I had my time again, I think I probably would have sent them all on sort of data modelling courses right at the beginning, get them building small-scale databases and, playing around with that, because, what you can do in terms of calculation and flexibility, far greater than anything you can do on a VLOOKUP. Word of advice, at least get people trained on Power Pivot rather than just, if anybody, if you see a VLOOKUP anywhere, shoot them. So Prevero is not a spreadsheet. So understanding cubes also means you get a greater understanding of dimensions and hierarchies work. Now, pretty much every single organisation I've ever done consultancy for, we've always had a challenge about getting the dimensions and hierarchies right. My theory is this. People tend to create hierarchies based on reporting lines. And historically, the old-fashioned reporting solutions, you could only get a report aggregated if you had the hierarchy, based on that particular hierarchy. There's no other way of doing it. It's not a problem anymore. You can aggregate on the fly any number of data sets. What I'd always say is keep your hierarchies and dimensions. So dimensions, by the way, is how you slice the information, what view your organisation is. So for example, your clients would be one, your team would be another one. And hierarchy is the level of aggregation. So at the centre, I've got the firm here. Keep that pure and simple as possible, based on some logical groupings. Nothing to do with the organisation structure, because, again, a show of hands, how many of you guys have undergone a restructure in the last 12 months? Yeah. And how often do you think organisational restructures happen? So the key principles is just keep them really pure and simple, but more importantly, each of these, what I call the grains, as you add them up, you get to the same number all the way through. Doesn't matter which slice of information that you have, you always get that same number. So when you're looking at allocations, the example I had earlier, I talked about having that dummy employee. You could potentially use dummy members in each of these as well to pick up costs that you're not allocating specifically. An example of that would be if you offered a discount to a client. You certainly want it at the client level, but the individuals performing it, it's unfair to actually apply it against their revenue, so you wouldn't necessarily allocate it down there. So what you would do is actually have a dummy client where you'd capture, or a dummy employee to capture all those, so that when you do add up, it gets back to that firm level. Again, I know I'm being pedantic, but I'm an accountant at the end of the day. And last thing, I know Mark and Hotels and More team mentioned it as well. Prevero does need squeaky clean data. It's no different from any other CPM application, but we had challenges like making sure that the data is in the right formats and and all sorts. So we had to spend a lot of time just making sure that we got the data right. One of the things I talked about when I said an information strategy, the next stage is usually your data strategy and data governance. That has to be a building block before you do anything else. So get your data right. So enough rambling from me. I'd appreciate if you've got any questions, thoughts, comments, even if somebody says, right, what a load of rubbish.
around of the networking session
Yes,
afterwards?
I will be.
Thanks so much. I think it's very insightful. And no, it's not common to talk about profitability analysis. So I'm really glad we had this experience working with Bob Dickinson in this topic. Thanks a lot.